All right, so go ahead and try to remember a positive memory that you have from maybe the past year or so, something like sensory rich and meaningful to you. Don't necessarily try to imagine it, just observe what your mind does. So maybe you're coming into this video and you learned about aphantasia, you're trying to figure out if you have it, or maybe you're trying to develop visualization if you don't have it or you have weak visualization. By the end of this video, I'm going to shed some light on what forms a mental image in the first place and hopefully help you to better tell if you're thinking visually or not at all. First, we're going to play with one of my favorite exercises I came up with called familiar actions to play a mental scenario in our mind. Then I'll describe the main attributes of visual thought that I look for when I'm coaching people. Then at the end of the video, hopefully you'll be able to tell what thoughts may have been visual, and you'll be extra clear on what thoughts weren't. So when I coach students in my program, I don't typically ask binary questions like, was it visual? Did you visualize? The answer to that is typically just going to be no. Instead, the main question to ask yourself is what was going on in my mind that may have not just been words? Because the experience of aphantasia is typically described as words or lists in the mind. So therefore, we need to look and analyze any thought patterns that may not be just words, that may be some sort of other sensory processing. So if somebody's aware that they're processing thought not just in lists or words or descriptors, here's the main visual attributes that I look for when I'm coaching people. I pretty much ask about these four every single time. Number one would be gestalt, kind of the overall thought of that scene. Number two would be shape. It's like the sense of roundness as opposed to just the word round. Three would be color, now the actual experience of a color, and we'll talk about that. Now four would be perspective, and that's like angle of direction. That's a little tricky. It can be mixed up with space, but we'll talk about that too. Now there could be subvisual elements, but these are the main ones that I look for. And it's great to keep in mind that these could exist in tandem, right? Shape and color, but they can exist one at a time in the mind as well. Okay, so the first step to figuring out if you have a visual thought happening or not is, of course, to think of something. So to do that, let's go ahead and play with an actual mental scenario. So now go ahead and close your eyes and just pay attention to the scenario I'm about to describe. So let's say it's a nice day out and you're at a park and it's kind of breezy, a little bit warm, maybe 70 degrees or so. You know, a nice kind of spring or summer day. And you're walking up to a park bench that is just along the edge of some grass. It's at the edge of some pavement there. You're walking up to this park bench and just looking at it as you're approaching it slowly to go have a seat. Okay, so now what you want to do is isolate a singular moment from that mental scene, one that stands out. And here's how to ask yourself about that. Answer this question. If I had to pick a moment from that mental scene that stands out from the rest, if I had to, what would I pick? Now, don't let yourself off the hook here. Remember, you're asking yourself if you had to pick one. Next, you're going to ask yourself how that moment occurred in your mind. And even if you stretch a little bit, what could you identify in that thought, in that moment, that could possibly be outside of just processing in words? Anything goes here. It may not even be visual yet. The how is important, not the what. So if you're remembering a scenario, it's not enough to just say, I remember walking up the stairs. How did you remember walking up the stairs? What actually happened in your mind to cause that memory to exist? And this could look like I could slightly feel my legs moving. I was aware of the movement of the steps. I could feel the handrail on my hand, things like that. That's the big question. If the moment wasn't just words in your mind, what was it? And once you can identify moments of thought that weren't just in words, well, now you have something to play with and analyze. Next, identify the visual elements to your thoughts. So going back to the main visual attributes that I pretty much always ask my students about, we won't really go over Gestalt right here. You could think of it as just broad vividness. I usually save that one for a little bit later in the sessions. Okay, so let's start with shape. So if we're thinking of, let's say, a beach ball, are we saying the word round to ourselves, or is there a sense of roundness? Is there a knowing of roundness, of the roundness of the ball? That's how you can start dissecting whether or not a thought might be a shape itself or the word that represents the shape. Next, color. So instead of thinking of the word sky blue, we may have the mental experience of that shade of blue. And color is really one of my favorites because there's only a certain number of ways that color can even exist. It's a completely subjective experience, by the way. So I can't tell if my blue is the same as your blue. Your blue might be my green. We don't have a way to tell that quite yet. So the main ways you can experience color is the name of a color, which doesn't actually represent the color itself. It's just language-based naming, so we can identify. You can have an emotional description of the color, but that's cultural, so red will mean different things to different cultures, right? Or you can have the color itself. That's really the only way it can exist. So if you have a shade in mind, and it's not just the name of the color, it may be a visual thought there. And last would be perspective, or you could call it orientation. So going back to our park bench scenario, perspective would be if you had any kind of sense of angle at which you would have been approaching the park bench, or maybe a light sensation of seeing the park bench. It can be a little bit mixed in with like a spatial or directional sensing, but more geared for like visual sense of what the park bench would look like from a certain angle. So that's a great question to ask yourself here. Was there any sense of angle as I described the park bench from earlier? And other sub-attributes that we could go over just briefly, I'm just going to touch on these, would be something like motion. So was there a sense of movement towards the park bench? Contrast, light and dark. Was there a sense of brightness of the scene around you because it was, I described it as daytime? And texture. Could you kind of feel or know the texture behind the park bench or the texture of the wood? There could be other sub-attributes, of course. It's just these are the main ones that I focus on when I work with people. Now, this exercise is really effective, and here's why, too, is because I'm the one talking, right? I'm the one describing the scene. So you're just listening. Now, if you're listening and there's other things happening in your mind to process the narration that I'm saying, well, it could be some sensory information or some other type of thought processing other than just words. So now let's bring it home and integrate this into what it actually means for us. So if you're wondering if you have aphantasia, well, here's a good starting point. Ask yourself, what did I process that wasn't just words in that memory, in that scene of the park bench, whatever it may be? And if there was thought processing beyond just narration and words in your mind, well, what was it? Dig in there. You could have some sensory information happening that may be visual, even slightly. And for people that are training visualization, well, the better that you can identify the difference between thought types and then whether or not those differences are visual in nature and recognize those visual elements, then you'll be able to continually build the scaffold of the visual scene in your mind. So now here's the big question. If you had one thing that you learned or one observation from this video and this process that we've done together today, what would that be? Go ahead and comment down below. And I hope you found this enlightening. I hope this helped you to analyze your thought processes a little bit better so that you could tell if visual thoughts are happening or not. Or keep in mind too, this is a spectrum of experience, right? So somebody at aphantasia down here and somebody at hyperphantasia up here, there might be a whole range of things you could experience in between there. So even if a thought was like barely visual, that might be something, and you can play with that. You can build on that. All right, and that's all I got for today. I will see you next time.